What truly happens when loyalty collides with destiny on a tower high above the sleeping castle? The air bites with cold, torches flicker against stone, and somewhere in the dark, two minds sharpen like blades. You probably won't survive this, but you'll understand it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a rain-soaked hillside in October 1066, watching the aftermath of a battle that changed everything about England and, as you will soon discover, about one bloodline in particular. The Norman conquest brought William the Conqueror to English shores, a historical fact that restructured land ownership across the entire island, creating new noble families and erasing old ones with the efficiency of a clerk updating a particularly violent spreadsheet. Among the Norman soldiers picking through the carnage, you spot a young man named Bertrand, bleeding from wounds that should have killed him twice over, his chainmail torn, his sword lost somewhere in the mud that seems determined to swallow the dead and living alike. What you cannot see, but what you will come to understand, is that Bertrand has just made a bargain. Historians debate whether such battlefield conversion stories represent genuine religious experiences or post-traumatic confabulations, and honestly, Bertrand himself probably couldn't tell you which it was at this point. He whispered something into the fog, offered something intangible from his future bloodline, and in return, he stopped dying. Quite a trade, really. Like agreeing to a terms of service agreement without reading the fine print, except the fine print was written in your descendants' nightmares. The quirky historical footnote here is that several Norman families recorded similar miraculous survivals in the weeks following Hastings, leading some fringe historians to suggest a pattern of desperate bargains that shaped English aristocracy in ways the official records conveniently forgot. Bertrand would eventually take the name Black after the color of the sky that night, after the pit he glimpsed when he made his choice, after the future that stretched before his bloodline like a beautiful, terrible road, paved with intentions that stopped being good around the third generation. You drift forward through time like a leaf on dark water, and now you stand before a construction site in the year 1215, the same year that King John signed the Magna Carta and invented the concept of being forced to admit you were wrong, which remains humanity's least favorite activity. The Black family has prospered in the century and a half since Bertrand's bargain, accumulating land and wealth and a reputation for being eerily fortunate in ways that made their neighbors both envious and uncomfortable. The manor rising before you sits upon a hill where Roman temples once stood, 3 of them dedicated to gods whose names the locals had forgotten, but whose presence lingered like the smell of smoke in a room where fires burned centuries ago. You watch workers haul stone from a quarry 5 miles distant, their labor songs drifting across the moorland, and you notice something that the workers themselves try not to discuss. The stones fit together almost before they're placed, as if the building wants to exist, as if it's been waiting for hands to give it form. Sir Gerard Black, Bertrand's great-great-grandson, supervises with the nervous energy of a man who inherited both wealth and the vague sense that the family luck comes with invoices that haven't yet arrived. The architectural plans show geometric patterns that modern scholars debate represented either sophisticated mathematical knowledge borrowed from Islamic architects during the Crusades or something else entirely that defies comfortable categorization. Some researchers point to similarities with structures in places Gerard Black definitely never visited, which is the kind of coincidence that stops being coincidental after you encounter enough of them. Gerard's wife, Lady Eloise, watches from a covered carriage, and you see her lips moving in constant prayer, a habit she developed after her wedding night, when she dreamed of all the children she would have and all the ways the family gift would touch each one differently. The construction takes 7 years, which Gerard jokes is 1 year for each deadly sin, though the laughter that follows sounds like someone trying to convince themselves something is funny rather than genuinely finding humor in it. You know that laugh. You've probably deployed it at family gatherings yourself. When the manor finally stands complete, casting its shadow across land that remembers older shadows, Gerard hosts a feast that lasts 3 days and attracts guests from across the region, all of whom will later describe a strange reluctance to leave, as if the house had already begun collecting what it was owed. You step into the year 1349, and immediately you wish you hadn't, because the air itself tastes like grief and smoke, and the particular desperation of a society watching itself collapse one household at a time. The Black Death has arrived in England, that pandemic that killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population and reshaped everything from labor economics to theological philosophy, proving that history's most significant events rarely announce themselves politely. Black Manor stands like a fortress against the plague, its inhabitants sealed inside while villages in the valley below empty one by one, their church bells eventually falling silent because there's no one left to ring them. It's the medieval equivalent of when your group chat goes quiet, except permanent and considerably more tragic. You find Aldrich Black, the current lord, standing in the great hall staring at his hands, which have developed dark patches that should mean he's dying but somehow don't. He's been ill for 3 weeks, far longer than plague victims typically survive, and his servants have begun whispering that perhaps the family fortune extends to survival itself, which sounds like good news until you consider what might be required in exchange. The quirky historical tidbit you encounter here involves the medieval practice of employing plague doctors, whose beaked masks filled with flowers and herbs were believed to filter corrupted air, a theory of disease transmission called miasma that was completely wrong but at least had aesthetic commitment. Aldrich recovers, if recovery is the right word for what happens to him, and you witness the first morning he wakes speaking fluent Arabic, a language he has never studied, describing places in the Holy Land he has never visited, reciting prayers to deities whose names haven't been spoken aloud in this part of the world since the Romans left. His wife, Margaret, calls for priests, and the priests call for more priests, and eventually everyone agrees that this is probably fine and definitely not something they should investigate too closely, demonstrating humanity's eternal talent for choosing comfortable denial over uncomfortable truth. The scholarly debate surrounding sudden linguistic capabilities in medieval accounts centers on whether these represented genuine glossolalia, misreported seizure activity, or elaborate hoaxes designed to claim divine favor. Aldrich himself seemed unbothered by the academic implications, being rather more focused on the fact that something inside him had been rearranged without his consent. You follow him through the months after his recovery, watching him wander the manor at night, pausing at walls as if listening to voices on the other side, occasionally responding in languages that shift mid-sentence like a radio dial sliding between stations. The servants learn to ignore this, developing that particular skill that household staff throughout history have cultivated, the ability to witness the extraordinary and file it under "not my problem." Aldrich's children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, inherit varying degrees of the family sensitivity. The eldest son sees nothing unusual at all and becomes a successful merchant, while the youngest daughter refuses to enter certain rooms and eventually joins a convent, which is medieval speak for, "I need to get away from this family immediately." The plague eventually releases its grip on England, leaving behind a transformed society where labor has become valuable and peasants have begun questioning why they should accept their previous circumstances, which you might recognize as the beginning of changes that would take centuries to fully manifest. History moves slowly until suddenly it doesn't, like a cat that's been watching a bird for an hour before the decisive pounce. You leave 1349 with the understanding that Aldrich Black's survival was not luck or miracle, but payment on a debt that Bertrand initiated 3 centuries earlier, and that the payment schedule, like most things involving ancestral bargains made in battlefield fog, was open to interpretation in ways that favored the creditor rather than the debtor. The manor itself seems larger now, though no construction has been done, as if the building grows in response to what it contains, adding rooms that weren't there before, corridors that take longer to walk than they should. The architecture has begun arguing with geometry, and geometry is losing. Aldrich dies at 73, an extraordinary age for the period, surrounded by descendants who will carry his blood and his burden forward into centuries he cannot imagine, including one where someone will tell his story to strangers who are trying to fall asleep, which is either a strange form of immortality or an invasion of privacy, depending on your perspective. The Black family tree has set its roots, and those roots have found something in the dark soil beneath the manor, something that feeds them and is fed in return, a symbiosis that Bertrand probably should have asked more questions about before agreeing to terms that his descendants would still be fulfilling when the Norman conquest became ancient history and the plague became a chapter in textbooks rather than a lived nightmare. You arrive in the reign of Henry VIII, that period of English history when divorce became a constitutional crisis and every monastery in the country suddenly discovered that their real estate had been aggressively reclassified. The year is 1539, and Margaret Black, named for her ancestor who survived the plague by marrying into a family she didn't fully understand, stands in the Great Hall of Black Manor, reading a letter that informs her the abbey 3 miles distant will be dissolved by royal decree, its treasures claimed for the crown, its inhabitants scattered like seeds in an unwelcoming wind. The dissolution of the monasteries transferred roughly 1/5 of England's landed wealth from the church to the crown and its supporters, a historical fact that reshaped religious practice, property law, and the architectural landscape of the country for centuries. Margaret, however, has a different response than most of her neighbors, who are busy calculating how to profit from the upheaval. She sends her most trusted servant to the abbey in the dead of night, with instructions that you overhear as you drift alongside him through moonlit fields that smell of spring rain and something older. The monks have been preparing for this, and what they hand over fills 3 carts covered with canvas that no one will ever lift. Relics, manuscripts, and objects that the church officially denies exist, items that Margaret's family has been quietly protecting since the Crusades introduced certain complications to the Black family's already complicated spiritual portfolio. You follow the carts back to the manor and down into cellars that weren't on the original plans, through doors that open at Margaret's touch and no one else's, into rooms that generations of Black family members have expanded in response to the growing collection of things that shouldn't exist but stubbornly do. The quirky historical footnote here involves the persistent rumors that certain English families acted as unofficial repositories for objects the church wanted neither destroyed nor acknowledged. Scholars debate whether this represented genuine preservation efforts or elaborate myth-making by families seeking to enhance their mystique. And Margaret Black, if asked, would probably smile in a way that answered nothing. The hidden passages she builds to protect this collection would eventually extend throughout the manor, creating a secondary architecture within the architecture, a house within the house that responds to Black family blood in ways that later generations will document with increasing scientific precision and increasing unease. You watch Margaret conduct her household with the efficiency of a general preparing for siege, aware that the political winds could shift in any direction. Henry's daughters wait in the wings, each representing different religious futures, and a wise noble prepares for all possibilities while committing publicly to none. Her husband, Thomas, handles the public face of Black family loyalty, appearing at court with appropriate frequency and appropriate gifts and appropriate expressions of enthusiasm for whatever the king is currently enthusiastic about, which is its own form of survival skill. Margaret's contribution is quieter, the relics hidden, the passages concealed, the family's peculiar inheritance protected from religious upheaval that might view such things as either blasphemy or treasure, depending on who was doing the viewing. The joke Thomas tells at dinner parties is that his wife renovates constantly because she's never satisfied with the decor, when the truth is that Margaret hasn't changed a visible thing in the manor for 15 years. All her construction happens in dimensions that guests aren't invited to notice. Rooms whose entrances look like walls until a black hand presses the right stone. You see the first ghost clearly during this period, or at least the first ghost that isn't a trick of light or a servant moving through corridors after midnight. She appears to Margaret during the evening meal, sitting at the far end of the table where no seat has been placed, wearing clothes 2 centuries out of fashion, and watching with eyes that track Margaret's movements with something that might be approval or hunger or both. Margaret doesn't react, has learned not to react, continues her conversation with Thomas about household accounts while her peripheral vision maintains a count of presences she cannot see directly without inviting more intimate acquaintance. The ghost vanishes after 3 nights, as they typically do, and Margaret makes a note in a journal that her descendants will continue updating into the present day, a record of manifestations that currently runs to 17 volumes and has attracted the attention of researchers who can't publish what they've found without destroying their careers. Tudor England transforms around the manor. Edward VI's brief Protestant reign, Mary's Catholic restoration, Elizabeth's careful compromise, and the Black family survives each transition by being useful, unremarkable, and in possession of secrets that various factions would rather not see revealed. Margaret dies in 1587, having outlived most of her contemporaries and all 4 of her children, except one, a daughter named Anne, who inherits the manor, the collection, and the understanding that survival is the family business, however uncomfortable that business might become. The passages Margaret built will confuse architectural historians for centuries, their layouts seemingly impossible given the manor's external dimensions, their age difficult to determine through standard dating methods. Some researchers argue their Victorian additions mislabeled, while others suggest the Black family simply had access to construction knowledge that wasn't supposed to arrive in England for another 200 years. You leave the Tudor period with the image of Margaret's ghost journal still vivid, those careful entries recording dates, locations, and descriptions of things that visited the manor with increasing frequency, as if whatever Bertrand had contacted in 1066 was checking on its investment with the dedication of a very patient landlord. You enter the 17th century just as England prepares to tear itself apart, because if there's one thing humanity excels at, it's finding reasons to fight family members over abstract concepts, while absolutely convinced that everyone else started it. The English Civil War, beginning in 1642 and concluding in 1651, would kill an estimated 300,000 people in a nation of 5 million, making it proportionally one of the deadliest conflicts in English history, a fact that provides important context for understanding why the Black family's particular contribution to this period would echo through their bloodline for centuries. You find yourself standing in the Great Hall of Black Manor, watching twin brothers, Edmund and Edward Black, argue with the passionate conviction of 23-year-olds who have never had to actually test their beliefs against reality's unyielding edges. Edmund supports Parliament, having spent time at Cambridge among reformist thinkers who believe the king's authority should be checked by elected representatives. Edward supports the crown, having served briefly at court where he developed loyalty to an institution he experienced as gracious hosts and fine wine rather than abstract political theory. Their mother, Catherine, watches from the doorway with the expression of a woman who has seen this argument's outline in family portraits stretching back 4 centuries, the same pattern of brothers dividing, the curse selecting favorites in ways that seem designed to maximize long-term suffering. The quirky historical detail you encounter here involves the numerous documented cases of English Civil War families who found themselves split by political loyalty, sometimes facing each other across actual battlefields. The Black brothers would take this pattern and add complications that the historical record has quietly decided to ignore. Edmund rides to join Parliament's forces 2 days after the argument, and you follow him through training camps and skirmishes where his survival repeatedly defies probability. Bullets curving around him, swords sliding past vital organs, horses throwing riders before hooves can connect with his vulnerable skull. He writes letters home describing his blessed luck, and never mentions the shadow that walks beside him now, visible in the periphery of his vision, offering suggestions in languages he shouldn't understand about where to stand and when to move. Edward, meanwhile, joins the royalist cavalry and experiences the opposite phenomenon. Injuries that should heal quickly fester, opportunities that should succeed collapse, allies who should survive fall beside him with expressions of confused betrayal. You watch him write his own letters home, these ones filled with questions about family history, requests for access to the journals their mother keeps locked in rooms he's never been permitted to enter. The scholarly debate surrounding psychological differences between siblings, even identical twins, often centers on environmental factors. Edmund and Edward had identical upbringings, yet their experiences during the war diverged so dramatically that modern researchers studying their well-preserved correspondence have proposed everything from confirmation bias to statistical anomaly to explanations they can't publish in peer-reviewed journals. Catherine Black, watching her sons destroy themselves on opposite sides of a conflict that she considers irrelevant compared to the older war her family has been fighting since 1066, makes a decision that will reshape the curse's distribution for generations. You follow her down into passages that twist through geometries that shouldn't fit within the manor's walls, past doors that open at her touch and close behind her with the finality of choices that cannot be unmade. What she does in those hidden rooms you cannot see clearly, the ritual or bargain or renegotiation obscured by shadows that seem to lean in rather than away from the candlelight. But the results become apparent within weeks. Edmund's luck continues, but with a new edge, each survival costing something he can feel but cannot name, while Edward's misfortunes stabilize into something survivable, if not comfortable. Catherine has not ended the curse, but divided it, split the inheritance between her sons so that neither receives the full blessing or the full burden, creating two distinct lineages from one bloodline. Scholars who study family genealogies and don't believe in curses have called this the Black Bifurcation, pointing to the dramatically different fates of the two branches as evidence that 19th century industrialization affected rural and urban Black descendants differently, which is true as far as it goes but doesn't go nearly far enough. The war ends with the king's execution, Edmund triumphant and Edward exiled, and you watch the brothers meet one final time at the manor where they were born. Strangers now, despite sharing blood and memories and the weight of expectations they never asked to carry. Their conversation lasts 3 hours, and when Edward rides away toward France, he takes with him the knowledge that his descendants will never feel entirely comfortable in England again, that something in the bargain their distant ancestor struck recognizes them as the lesser portion. Edmund claims the manor and begins the systematic documentation that his descendants will continue, hiring scholars to research family history, commissioning artists to paint portraits that seem to age independently of the physical canvas, building a library of materials related to the family curse that will eventually require its own wing. The restoration brings the monarchy back and the Black family back into royal favor, Edmund's Civil War allegiances conveniently forgotten in the interest of maintaining social stability. Another joke at history's expense, that principles held worth dying for become embarrassments to be papered over once the dying stops being fashionable. You leave the 17th century understanding that the Black family tree has forked, that Edward's descendants will build their own traditions and their own relationships with whatever Bertrand contacted centuries ago, and that family reunions will become increasingly tense affairs where nobody mentions the curse, but everybody calculates its current distribution with the attention of investors monitoring a particularly volatile stock. You drift into the 18th century like smoke through a keyhole, finding yourself in a laboratory that smells of sulfur, mercury, and the particular desperation of a man who has bet everything on a theory that keeps almost working. Edmund Black Fee. The Georgian Blacks were not creative with names, believing repetition provided continuity, and possibly hoping the curse would lose track of which Edmund was which. Stands before a furnace that burns with colors fire shouldn't produce, consulting notes written partly in code and partly in symbols that the code itself cannot explain. The historical fact that grounds this period is the practice of alchemy, which in the 18th century existed in strange tension with emerging chemistry. Isaac Newton himself devoted more pages to alchemical research than to physics, a detail that respectable biographers tend to hurry past while coughing uncomfortably. Edmund has inherited the manor, the library, the journals, and the family conviction that the curse represents not punishment, but unfinished business. a transaction that began in 1066 and awaits completion by someone clever enough to understand the original terms. His obsession with alchemical transmutation began reasonably enough. The dream of turning lead into gold has attracted brilliant minds throughout history, but has evolved into something more specific, a belief that the curse itself can be transmuted, transformed from obligation into power, from debt into asset. The quirky historical tidbit you discover in his laboratory involves the 18th century interest in aerial spirits, beings that alchemists believed could be contacted through specific chemical processes. Edmund's notes reference experiments designed to communicate with the original creditor, which is either metaphor or terrifying depending on how seriously you take family journals. You watch him spend the family fortune on increasingly exotic materials: antimony from Hungary, cinnabar from Spain, salts whose provenance his suppliers prefer not to discuss, manuscripts that arrive in sealed containers with warnings written in languages the delivery men cannot read. His wife, Elizabeth, manages the household's public face with the practiced skill of someone married to a black, telling visitors that Edmund's interests lie in natural philosophy and hoping nobody asks follow-up questions. The servants have learned not to enter the laboratory wing at certain hours, having discovered through unpleasant experience that some experiments prefer witnesses, while others react to additional presence, like flames, react to unexpected oxygen. Edmund's journals, which you read over his shoulder as he makes entries by candlelight, describe progress in terms that modern chemists find disturbing, not because they're wrong, but because they're right about things they shouldn't be right about. He's identified the atomic weight of elements that wouldn't be isolated for another century, described crystal structures that required electron microscopes to confirm, theorized about processes that quantum mechanics would eventually formalize in mathematics he lacked the notation to express. Scholars who've examined these journals debate whether they represent genuine prescient knowledge, elaborate hoaxes created by later family members, or simply the pattern-matching tendency of researchers who want to find significance. The Black family position, unofficially expressed at academic conferences where they occasionally appear to add chaos, is that the journals are exactly what they appear to be, and that perhaps science should ask more uncomfortable questions about where knowledge comes from. You follow Edmund through years of experiments that nearly succeed, transmutations that work once and never again, communications that seem to connect and then dissolve like dreams upon waking. He bankrupts the estate twice, recovers through lucky investments that his journals suggest were advised, and continues his work with the determination of someone who believes he's one insight away from changing everything. His children, 3 daughters and a son, learn to navigate a household where breakfast conversation might include discussions of philosophical mercury and where their father's moods correlate with astronomical events nobody else is tracking. The son, Edmund VI, will eventually inherit the manor and the obsession, continuing his father's work while adding the innovation of actually keeping financial records, a skill that future generations will come to appreciate. The Georgian period in the Black family history establishes patterns that persist into modernity. The systematic approach to the curse, the belief that understanding equals control, the library that grows faster than human lifespans can reasonably explore. You witness the manor's first scientific visitor, who's not also a family member, a Swedish mineralogist named Lindqvist, who arrives to consult on rare earth samples and leaves 3 weeks later with notes he will never publish, having seen things in the laboratory that his training insists cannot exist. Edmund V dies in 1783, the same year the Treaty of Paris ends the American Revolution and creates a new nation whose founding documents speak of rights that Edmund might have appreciated in theory while being too occupied with other liberations to notice. His final journal entry describes an experiment that he calls promising, a word that his descendants have learned to interpret as meaning either breakthrough or catastrophe, the difference often apparent only in retrospect. The laboratory remains sealed for 15 years after his death, until Edmund VI determines that enough time has passed for whatever was promising to have stabilized into something manageable. He's partially right, which in Black family terms counts as a victory. You leave the 18th century with the understanding that the blacks have shifted from passive inheritors of the curse to active investigators, treating their strange legacy as a problem to be solved rather than a fate to be endured, and that this shift has implications that will take another 2 centuries to fully manifest. You arrive in Victorian England to the sound of table rapping, a curious percussion that swept through fashionable society like a parlor game that took itself too seriously, and you find yourself in the drawing room of Black Manor, where approximately 40 guests have gathered to witness something their education insists cannot happen. The historical context is the spiritualist movement, which emerged in 1848 with the Fox sisters in New York and spread across the Atlantic with the speed of an idea whose time had come. By the 1870s, seances had attracted the attention of everyone from Queen Victoria herself to scientists determined to expose fraud to genuine believers seeking contact with the dead. Cordelia Black, the current matriarch, stands at the center of tonight's gathering with the poise of someone who has spent her entire life prepared for a moment exactly like this one. She's arranged the chairs in specific patterns that her journals describe as acoustically optimal, which is a wonderfully Victorian way of saying, the things I'm summoning prefer geometry, and she's selected guests whose mixture of skepticism and desperation provides what she calls productive tension. You settle into an empty corner and watch as the lights dim, the candles flutter despite no apparent draft, and Cordelia begins speaking in a voice that starts at conversational and descends into registers that human vocal cords shouldn't comfortably produce. The quirky historical footnote here involves the vigorous scientific investigation of seances during this period. Researchers including Michael Faraday and Alfred Russel Wallace devoted serious attention to examining claims of spirit communication, reaching dramatically different conclusions that reflect the era's tension between emerging scientific materialism and persistent human longing for something more. Cordelia's seances differ from the typical Victorian variety in ways that her guests initially interpret as superior theatrical production. The table doesn't just rap, it levitates, hovers at chest height, while skeptics crawl beneath it, searching for wires, and rotates slowly like a lazy ceiling fan before settling back to the floor with the gentle click of wood on wood. The voices that speak through Cordelia don't deliver generic messages of love from deceased relatives, but specific information: the location of lost documents, the contents of sealed wills, the final words of relatives who died alone, details that the recipients confirm with expressions of mingled relief and horror. You watch the famous spiritualist Daniel Douglas Home attend one of Cordelia's sessions, a man whose own phenomena had been investigated by scientists and aristocrats across Europe. He leaves after 20 minutes, pale and silent, and his journals from this period, now held by the British Library, contain entries about Black Manor that archivists have flagged as anomalous and possibly damaged. The scholarly debate surrounding Victorian spiritualism centers on how to explain the movement's extraordinary popularity among educated people who should have known better. Explanations range from grief culture following the Civil War to the social utility of women having public voices in seance settings to mass delusion facilitated by dim lighting and wishful thinking. Cordelia's explanation, recorded in journals that match her grandmother's handwriting style 5 generations earlier, is simpler. She's not contacting the dead, but rather introducing her guests to things that were never alive in the human sense. Entities that find the Victorian interest in spirit communication amusing and useful for purposes they don't explain. Her guests never quite realize this distinction, though some of them dream afterwards about conversations they don't remember having, wake with knowledge they can't explain, find themselves making decisions that seem obvious in retrospect, but that they would never have considered before attending that particular dinner party. The Black family has learned to weaponize the curse, or rather has learned that the curse can be shared under certain circumstances, distributed among willing recipients who don't understand what they're receiving until it's too late to return the gift. You follow Cordelia through a decade of seances that attract increasingly prominent guests, members of parliament, industrialists, a minor European royal whose presence is never officially recorded, watching her build a network of people who owe their success partly to insights acquired in her drawing room and who will prove useful when the family requires favors. Her husband, Arthur, handles the financial implications with the skill of someone who married into the Black family, understanding exactly what that meant. Having grown up as the seventh son of a minor baron with no expectations and considerable ambition, their children, 5 in total, inherit varying degrees of their mother's abilities. The eldest daughter becomes a renowned hostess whose dinner parties influence policy. The youngest son retreats to the manor's library and emerges only for meals, having found in the family archives something that occupies his attention completely. The phenomena at Black Manor intensify during this period. The presence that has accumulated since Bertrand's bargain becoming bold enough to manifest visibly during daylight hours, to speak in voices that servants can hear, to rearrange furniture in patterns that Cordelia recognizes from her great-great-grandmother's journals. She doesn't attempt to banish these visitors, wouldn't know how, she admits privately, but instead negotiates with them, establishes protocols that govern their behavior within the house, creates what she calls house rules that both sides mostly honor. Victorian Black Manor becomes a kind of embassy, you realize, a neutral ground where human and whatever else they are can interact according to agreements that date back to foggy battlefield deals, but have been refined through centuries of cohabitation. Cordelia's innovations include the first photographic documentation of manifestations, blurry images that skeptics dismiss as double exposure, but that family members recognize as showing things that cameras shouldn't be able to capture at all. She also establishes the tradition of the midnight census, a nightly count of presences within the manor that her descendants will maintain with increasing precision as technology improves, tracking patterns that suggest migration, breeding cycles, or something that human vocabulary hasn't evolved to name. The Victorian period ends with Cordelia's death in 1901, the same year Queen Victoria dies, and a new century begins with promises of progress that will be tested severely within 15 years. Her final séance, held 3 days before her death, draws no guests, only family members, arranged in patterns she's never used before, conducting a ritual whose purpose she refuses to explain. Whatever happens in that final session remains unrecorded except for a single line in her journal. They have agreed to the new terms. You leave Victorian England understanding that the Black family curse has evolved from burden to partnership, from survival tactic to competitive advantage, and that the 20th century will test whether that partnership can survive the unprecedented violence humanity is about to unleash upon itself. You emerge into the 20th century to the sound of artillery, that industrial percussion that would define the next 50 years and reshape the Black family, along with everyone else who survived its terrible efficiency. The First World War begins in 1914 and ends in 1918, killing approximately 17 million people and wounding another 20 million, a historical fact that provides necessary context for understanding why the Black family's losses during this period would fundamentally alter their relationship with the curse they'd spent centuries managing. You find yourself in the manor's Great Hall, now converted to a convalescent hospital as part of the national effort to accommodate wounded soldiers returning from France, watching Eleonora Black supervise nurses who have learned not to ask questions about certain patients' recoveries. The quirky historical detail from this period involves the widespread reports of supernatural experiences among soldiers in the trenches, the Angels of Mons, phantom battalions, dead comrades appearing to deliver warnings, experiences that official histories dismiss as shell shock, but that soldiers themselves often insisted were genuine until they learned that insisting got them committed to asylums. Eleonora has sent 3 sons to France, following the family tradition of service that dates to Bertrand's original military context, and you watch her receive telegram after telegram with the practiced stillness of someone who has prepared herself for exactly this information. Harold, the eldest, dies at the Somme in 1916. William, The middle son survives Passchendaele in 1917, with wounds that should have been fatal but somehow weren't. Geoffrey, the youngest, disappears during the spring offensive of 1918 and is never officially found, though Eleanor's journals record conversations with something wearing his face that visited the manor for 3 consecutive nights that November. The scholarly debate surrounding grief experiences after catastrophic loss often centers on whether apparition sightings represent psychological coping mechanisms or something more difficult to categorize. Eleanor's detailed notes, including transcriptions of conversations with the Geoffrey-shaped visitor, provide documentation that researchers find either compelling or disturbing depending on their prior commitments. William returns home bearing more than physical scars, having discovered in the trenches that the family gift extends to sensing imminent danger, a talent that saved his unit repeatedly and earned him decorations he never discusses. He spends the interwar years in the manor's library, correlating his battlefield experiences with family records stretching back centuries, building a theory about the curse's practical applications that his son will eventually test under even worse circumstances. The hospital converts back to private residence after the armistice, but something lingers. Patients who recovered against medical expectations sometimes return, drawn by pull they can't explain, and the village develops a reputation for housing veterans whose nightmares eventually quiet after spending time near the manor. You drift through the years between wars watching the Black family regroup, document, and prepare, their journals from this period filled with a particular tone of urgency that suggests they anticipated what was coming. George Black, William's son, joins the Royal Air Force in 1939 and becomes a Spitfire pilot during the Battle of Britain, that desperate summer when the war's outcome genuinely hung uncertain and every pilot flying against the Luftwaffe carried impossible odds. His survival rate should have been weeks. Average life expectancy for fighter pilots during the battle was measured in single digits. But George flies for 5 years, accumulates confirmed kills that place him among the top aces, and walks away from crashes that investigation teams record as unsurvivable, before learning not to send investigation teams to crashes involving pilots named Black. The historical fact that the Battle of Britain represented a turning point in the war, the first major campaign fought entirely by air forces and Hitler's first significant defeat, provides context for understanding why George's survival mattered beyond family sentiment. His continued presence allowed him to train other pilots, sharing not just technique but what he carefully called instinct for avoiding danger. George's younger sister, Margaret, serves as a codebreaker at Bletchley Park, her work officially classified for decades afterward, but family records noting that she sometimes provided correct decryptions before receiving the encrypted messages, a sequence of events that her supervisors learned not to examine too closely. The manor serves again as a hospital during the Second World War, and again recoveries occur that medical officers attribute to exceptional care rather than to the building itself, which has accumulated enough presence by now that sensitive visitors feel watched from the moment they enter. You witness the family's darkest moment in 1944, when George's aircraft is shot down over occupied France and the manor goes silent. Not quiet, silent. The accumulated presences retreating somewhere deep within the walls, as if mourning or planning or both. He returns 3 weeks later, having walked through enemy territory with assistance he describes only as guidance from family, and the presences return with him, more numerous than before, as if his survival had attracted new arrivals. The post-war Black family carries both triumph and burden. They've proven the curse's utility under extreme pressure, but also discovered that utility comes with costs that compound over generations. George's children, born in the optimistic 1950s, will grow up in a manor where the walls whisper and the shadows move, and the weight of expectation settles on them before they're old enough to understand what they're being prepared to inherit. The 20th century's violence accelerates the curse's development, you realize. Whatever Bertrand contacted in 1066 feeds on something that wars provide abundantly, and the Black family's prominence during both world conflicts has not been coincidental, but rather part of a longer pattern that extends backward and forward through history in ways that comfortable people prefer not to examine. You leave the World Wars period understanding that the Black family has paid in blood what other families paid in anonymity, that their visibility has protected and endangered them simultaneously, and that the second half of the 20th century will force them to confront whether the partnership their ancestors established can survive into an age that no longer believes in curses except as metaphor. You arrive in the contemporary period to the soft glow of computer screens, that blue light that has replaced candlelight as humanity's preferred illumination for late-night investigations into things we probably shouldn't understand. The current Black Manor serves as both family residence and research facility, its Georgian exterior concealing technology that would have appeared magical to Bertrand and probably still seems fairly magical to the accountants who try to explain the operating expenses. Dr. Victoria Black, the current family head, stands before a bank of monitors displaying real-time data from sensors distributed throughout the manor, electromagnetic field detectors, infrasound monitors, thermal imaging cameras, and several instruments that don't have official names because no legitimate manufacturer would admit to producing them. The historical fact that grounds this period is the emergence of ghost hunting as both entertainment and genuine research practice in the late 20th century, a development that Victoria has approached with the weary patience of someone whose family has been conducting rigorous documentation for centuries, while television shows pretend to invent the methodology. You watch her review footage from the previous night, 17 separate manifestations captured across 12 cameras. The presence is now numerous enough that the midnight census takes 3 hours to complete and requires a database that her grandfather developed on punch cards before transitioning through every subsequent computer architecture. The quirky historical tidbit here involves the Black family's contributions to computing. Jeffrey Black III, in the 1970s, developed data structures specifically designed to track nonlinear temporal patterns, work that found legitimate applications in financial modeling, but was originally intended for correlating ancestral phenomenon records with astronomical and geological events. Victoria's research focuses not on proving the curse exists. That question was settled for the family around the time of the Norman conquest, but on understanding its parameters, limitations, and potential for controlled application. Her published papers, appearing under pseudonyms in journals that don't require institutional affiliation, describe statistical patterns in manifestation behavior that other researchers attempt to replicate without success, unaware that replication requires access to a specific geographic location where the phenomena concentrate. The scholarly debate she navigates most carefully concerns the nature of consciousness itself. If the presences in Black Manor demonstrate responsive behavior, memory, and apparent preference, what ethical obligations do the living owe them? A question that her dissertation committee politely asked her to remove from her thesis because it made several members uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. You meet James Black, Victoria's younger brother, who has taken a different approach to the family inheritance. He writes fiction, novels that critics describe as surprisingly realistic supernatural horror, without realizing that the surprise is the realism rather than the horror. His books provide the family's primary public interface, stories close enough to truth that initiates recognize them while generic enough that ordinary readers file them under entertainment rather than testimony. The siblings represent the contemporary Black family's dual strategy: rigorous private documentation and careful public misdirection, maintaining the partnership their ancestors established while protecting both themselves and the presences from exposure that neither side wants. The manor itself has adapted to modern conditions. The presences seem to understand and avoid active recording, appear only on devices they've approved through mechanisms Victoria is still mapping, and generally behave with the discretion of longtime residents who understand that discretion protects everyone. Victoria's children, twins named Edward and Eleanor after ancestors whose stories you've already witnessed, show signs of the family sensitivity that skip generations, according to patterns the database has begun to predict. Edward, at 17, has already contributed to the midnight census by identifying presences that the instruments miss, his perception operating in frequencies the technology hasn't learned to detect. Eleanor, his twin, has the opposite gift. She can tell which recorded phenomena are genuine and which are artifacts, a discrimination that has improved the database's accuracy by 14% since she began reviewing footage 3 years ago. The partnership established in Battlefield Fog centuries ago has evolved into something resembling symbiosis, you understand. The Black family provides documentation, protection, and a stable environment, while the presences provide warnings, insights, and occasional assistance that manifests as improbable luck continuing through generations. The costs continue as well, compounding quietly. Family members die young at rates that actuaries would notice if they looked closely. Marriages fail when non-Black spouses can't adapt to the household's peculiarities. Children sometimes see things that require careful management before they understand what they're seeing. Victoria's journal entries, which you read over her shoulder as she types in the late-night hours when the manor grows active, describe the burden in terms her ancestors would recognize. Gratitude and resentment mixed in proportions that shift daily. Commitment to documentation that sometimes feels like service and sometimes like captivity. Love for a place that is also a prison that is also the only home where she could possibly belong. The future stretches before the Black family like the corridors of their manor, longer than it should be, containing more rooms than the exterior suggests, leading somewhere that generations of documentation haven't quite mapped. Victoria's latest project involves attempting communication through technological interfaces, messages transmitted to frequencies that theory suggests the presences might receive, an experiment that her grandfather began with radio transmitters and that she continues with equipment that makes radio look as primitive as smoke signals. Whether this represents progress toward understanding or escalation toward unknown consequences remains the kind of open question that scholarly debate phrases carefully and the Black family lives daily. You leave contemporary Black Manor with the understanding that the curse has become the family's identity, indistinguishable from the bloodline itself, a legacy that future generations will inherit whether they want it or not, along with the responsibility of maintaining records that now span nearly a millennium and the partnership with presences that have been watching the family as carefully as the family has been watching them. You begin to drift now, the manor growing soft at its edges, the accumulated centuries of Black family history settling into comfortable distance like a photograph album closing at the end of a long evening. The lights dim in the research laboratory where Victoria reviews the night's final readings, screens flickering to standby mode, instruments powering down with the quiet clicks of technology preparing for rest. Outside the manor's ancient windows, the moorland stretches toward horizons you can no longer see clearly. The same hills where Bertrand once stood bleeding and desperate, where he made a choice that would echo through bloodlines he couldn't imagine toward a future that now includes you, listening, drifting, beginning to release the weight of stories that belong to someone else's family tree. The presences withdraw to wherever they go during daylight hours, their surveillance relaxing into something that might almost be sleep, the partnership entering its nightly pause while both sides rest and regenerate for tomorrow's continuation of a relationship that has lasted longer than most nations. Victoria closes her laptop and stretches, her shadow moving across walls that hold more shadows than any single person could cast. And she thinks of her children sleeping upstairs, dreaming dreams that she hopes are ordinary but suspects are not, carrying forward the burden and blessing of being Black in ways they will understand gradually, the way she understood gradually, the way her father understood before her. The manor settles into darkness the way old houses do, creaking and sighing, releasing the heat of day, adjusting to night with the ease of practice that spans centuries of nights just like this one. You feel yourself becoming lighter, the narrative releasing its grip, the Black family legacy receding into comfortable distance where it belongs, their story, their curse, their complicated inheritance that you have witnessed but do not carry, documented but do not owe. The fire in the great hall dies to embers, and somewhere deep in passages that don't appear on any plans, something moves and then stops, waiting with patience that transcends human timescales for whatever comes next in a story that doesn't end but only pauses. gathering strength for future chapters that future generations will live and future voices will tell. Sleep finds you gently, the way moorland mist finds low places to settle, the way morning eventually finds even the longest nights. And as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts grow soft, you carry with you only the peace of stories completed, journeys finished, and the quiet understanding that some legacies belong to their inheritors, while you, fortunate witness, belong only to the comfortable darkness and the waiting dawn.